Hello, friends, and welcome back to another episode of the Liberty Weekly Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Patrick McFarlane, and this one is episode 82, and it is entitled The Lake Fiasco. And it's going to be a little bit of a shorter one here today, because as maybe many of you know, if you're a regular listener of the show, that I'm currently on hiatus as I'm studying for the bar exam and preparing to move and preparing to start my new job. And very exciting things, a lot of big changes happening in my life. So not a lot going on with the podcast, kind of putting that aside while I get settled. Very excited to get back to it. But I have this story that I wanted to share with everyone that has legal implications. And it's pretty entertaining, too. So I hope the title was attractive, The Lake Nuisance. It starts like this, right? So my wife and I are moving to start our new lives, and we're buying a house. So we just put an offer in on this property yesterday, and it's a lakefront property, a really good deal, and oddly enough, it's on the same lake in the same neighborhood as both my aunt and uncle and my parents. And I grew up in this neighborhood at my parents' house, obviously. So very excited. This all just kind of fell together. So that's where I am currently on vacation just for the weekend. It's my dad's birthday, so I'm in my old bedroom, and that bedroom has no furniture in it because, yeah, and so that's where the echo is, so I apologize for that. But so oddly enough, we all live on this same neighborhood, and I found this house on the neighborhood, and there is a hockey player that lives in the neighborhood. And he's not any special hockey player or anything. He played in the minor leagues for a while. He was drafted really high, but he was kind of a flop as a pick. But he owns the house next door to my aunt and uncle's house. And they were telling us today how many problems they've had with this hockey player guy. And the hockey player guy doesn't really even live in the neighborhood. They use it as like a vacation home. And it's nothing really too special. They fixed it up. You can see it on VRBO. And, rah, free market. They're renting out the place. They're making money. They're doing what they want on their land. But it does come with some problems. And that's why this episode is titled The Lake Fiasco, because this is the problem, essentially, is that he rents out the place to very loud and boisterous people, and it's a different group of people every weekend. The house, I think, can sleep 9, and so every weekend there's a group of blowhards that come up, and they get all ripped up, they get drunk, and they're yelling at all hours of the night, and there's booming music, and if it's not that, it's families with kids that screech and holler and scream, and these people don't care. And why should they? They're renting a place. And, oddly enough, I don't know if on VRBO, if there's an ability for the renter to rate the customers. So if you are a customer and you have a profile and you're renting a place, I really don't know how that works because I haven't used VRBO, but I assume it's kind of similar to Airbnb. And I haven't used that either. I'm a terrible libertarian. But so yeah, there's different groups of people up every week, and this week specifically, there's a group of, I don't know if they're hicks or what, but they're a bunch of assholes. They're super loud, and they're so loud, in fact, and drunk and rowdy during the day that we could not hear each other conversing in the living room, talking at normal volume. And so my aunt and uncle are just raging about this, man, and my parents live far enough away where it doesn't affect them too much. But I think they kind of feel the same way. So earlier in the day, now that we're buying the same house in this neighborhood, we decided to go to the homeowners association meeting, which just happened to be this weekend. I mean, everything's really been falling in line really oddly well. So for me, but I'm just kind of wondering, what's in store. Things going good, something bad has to happen. But so we go to the homeowners association, and in my bar study, I've been learning a little bit about this, and as we're going through the process of buying our own home, I'm learning a little bit more about this whole process and how it works, and what the homeowners associations are, and what zoning issues are, because to do this whole thing, my dad and I went to the zoning office, which really cheesed me, man. but the clerk was really nice and helpful. Tyranny with a smile. But we were looking at all the hoops that I have to jump through to buy this property, and the history of the property. There was like a fuel tank underneath the driveway that we need to know whether it was there or not, because if the soil's contaminated, the city's going to jump on our ass, or the county, or whoever does that. All these problems, and the zoning ordinances in the neighborhoods state that all the structures have to be 10 feet back from the roadway before you can even start building, and it just really pens in this property a little bit. But we still have room to build, and my dad wants to put in a garage, but the same problem. They've came up with these zoning problems, these zoning laws after my grandpa had already built this garage, and now my dad can't even add on to it because he wants to add 2 more cars deep, but he can't do that at all because he can only build in the footprint of this garage, and it just won't work out with setting it back. So that's kind of an aside, not really the focus I wanted to do, but you see how these zoning regulations really dictate what you can and can't do to your property. And I'm trying to use it as an in-way to kind of, convince my uncle and my dad that, the state is invalid and it's bullshit that they're, trying to tell you what you can do on your own property. But back to the nuisance, the noise violations. This kind of begs the question, how do we deal with this in an ANCAP society? And I immediately thought, homeowners associations. I haven't done a lot of looking into it, but we went to the meeting, and one of the big topics that is going on underneath is, well, we have this problem with people in the neighborhood renting out their cabins and their houses to loud, boisterous people. And the houses are relatively close together, so they're not spaced apart. In fact, it's situated on a bay, so that when people come, in the rentals are the only loud units in the entire bay. You can hear that it amplifies and echoes across the bay. And it's just a really bad situation. And justly, I think, my aunt and uncle are pissed about this. They're so mad. And in the homeowners association, they can't even enjoy their own home because these people next door are just so loud and boisterous. And it's different people every time. And I thought, how would this be handled in an anarcho-capitalist society? I think step one would be to talk to the homeowner and to say, hey, man, you got these people in there. Even though on VRBO you say no parties, but they're making life a living hell. We can't even relax on our own land. Every weekend it's different people and there's bumping music. We want to call the cops and this and this and that. I think step one would be talking to him. And I don't know if my aunt and uncle have spoken to him about it yet, but they want to call and squeal because he needs a rental permit and he did not get one. And I think the ordinances say that the city or the township cannot deny him a permit if he requests one. I don't know exactly how that works, but they want to, squeal and get the enforcement on the wing and come in and use the power of the state to stop this guy from leasing out his property. And, obviously that's not the solution that an ANCAP would propose, using the power of violence or coercion to put a stomp on it, But that's not to say that my aunt and uncle are unjustified. And in fact, I wanted to talk a little bit about a private nuisance action, which would be another option that they would have. So through the proper channels, through the way that the state exists today, the obvious answer for a normie or a statist or someone who plays by the rules would be to, get enforcement to tell, they're throwing these parties, he's renting the place out without a permit, go in there and stop it. Or another option that you have would be through the court system. And I don't really believe that initiating a private nuisance action through the courts, which is a type of tort, if I'm understanding it correctly. I have my bar prep stuff here, so I'm looking at that and I'm using it to do this episode and explain to you guys how a private nuisance would work. But private nuisances are very hard to prove, and the court actually doesn't really like to grant them. So we were kind of talking about this today. let me define for you what a private nuisance is. A private nuisance is a thing or activity that substantially and unreasonably interferes with the plaintiff's use and enjoyment of their land. Now, usually the mental state for this, as the defendant, if you're charging it from the plaintiff's point of view, you have to prove that, this isn't an element, but usually the mental state is that the activity you want to prevent is intentional, because once the defendant is placed on notice that their activity is interfering with the plaintiff's use and enjoyment of the land, and the defendant doesn't stop because the defendant knows that their activity is interfering with the plaintiff. So, yeah, step one is to inform this neighbor guy who doesn't live here that his rental units are really making life miserable for all the people who live on the block. And that was the talk of it wasn't the official talk of the homeowners association because it was just a picnic and there was no official business really happening. But some of the people who live on the block were discussing this issue, and there's rumblings in the work to get enforcement on and crack down on it. But I don't even know if anyone on the block has talked to this guy, That would be my first step, just say, hey, and if he's an asshole or something, then I guess you go on to step two. But, okay, so back to the private nuisance action. So we already explained what a private nuisance is. There are 5 factors that the court will consider when determining whether a nuisance is a substantial and unreasonable interference. Okay, and usually when you're trying to collect evidence on this, you have to show that the nuisance is continuous, that it has been happening for quite some time. So you have to have a wealth of evidence that you can introduce for this. But here we go. So the first one is that the value of the defendant's activity. So one thing that the court will consider is how valuable is it to the neighbor that he's renting out this property. And I'd assume it's pretty valuable. I think the property was going for like $250 a night or something like that. So it is a substantially beneficial economic activity for him. 2 would be the alternatives. The court would consider what are the alternatives in this situation. Well, I think there are some pretty good alternatives. He could, enforce or try to enforce the fact that these people need to be quiet and make it very important in the rental, just have strict instructions on the door or do his due diligence to make sure he's doing everything he can to make sure that whoever's renting this place knows that the neighborhood is a quiet neighborhood and that the neighborhood is very adverse to wild and boisterous parties that are going on. So he needs to enforce that. That would be an alternative. Let's see. The third element here is the nature of the locality. And I already kind of mentioned that. The neighborhood is quiet. There's a few retirees here, mostly families. And it's not really a vacation spot. It's not a party spot. It's a relatively wealthy area, not extravagantly so, but the area is being built up because the surrounding towns are getting all this influx of business currently. So there is a lot of old money here, but it's a quiet neighborhood. So the fourth element would be the extent of the plaintiff's injury, and I think it'd be pretty severe here. My aunt and uncle are explaining that, every weekend this is happening, every single weekend. It's during the summer. They can't enjoy their deck because there's these boisterous, drunk people just right across. I mean, it's not, maybe 30 yards away from their deck. And when you're sitting in the living room at my aunt and uncle's place, you can't hear just normal conversation sometimes. That's what it was like today when these guys were out there. And so it's substantial. They can't enjoy their own home. There's parties going on all the time. And so the fifth element that they would consider would be who was there first. And my aunt and uncle were there first. They've been living there for, 30 years. So this hockey player who moved in, he's been there for 8-10 years maybe, but he only just recently started renting the place out, maybe within a year or two. So aunt and uncle were there here. Everyone else in the neighborhood was there first. And so what are the remedies here? Well, you can get an injunction. That's what a private nuisance is usually. And to get an injunction, the plaintiff must persuade a judge that they are suffering irreparable harm. And this one is a little shaky because irreparable usually means that it can't be assuaged with damages, with monetary damages. This harm is irreparable. Once it's gone, it's gone, you know? And I'm trying to think of a situation in which they would be irreparable in a situation other than this, so you could have a comparison. I think one time in my property test, I had... Okay, this is a good example. One time in my property test, there was the example of a guy who had a cafe, or it was either a cafe or a child care center or something like that. And the nuisance question was that there was a methadone clinic right next door to his child care center. And there were heroin addicts and street people that were congregating outside of the methadone clinic every Wednesday or Thursday or something like that. And they were smoking cigarettes, they were swearing, there was all this bad stuff going on. And the irreparable harm would be the failure of the childcare business. The failure of that business because, parents found out there's a methadone clinic next door and they don't want their kids in the playground being exposed to heroin users who are going in and out, getting their methadone treatments. And so that would be irreparable harm. The fact that this man's business now has to close. So in this case, my aunt and uncle can't enjoy their home. I'm not sure how the court would rule on this, just because I haven't litigated any private nuisance actions. I would think it would be an irreparable harm. Just because, whether you finally, you can't live in your own house, essentially what's happening. You can't enjoy your weekends. I would say that would be, it'd be really hard to satisfy that with monetary damages. Although it's not a permanent harm. So those are some concerns that I have. But the second thing that the court would consider in determining or in rewarding or awarding an injunction would be whether damages are an inadequate remedy. So I would think that in certain jurisdictions, the court would also grant damages for a private nuisance, but usually a plaintiff does not want monetary damages. They want to enjoy their property. So they are not satisfied by just getting damages. They want the court to stop them from doing something. So those are the factors. I do think that libertarian legal theory would support private nuisance actions because I think fundamentally, there is no material aggression. There is no tangible aggression, but you're talking about damaging someone's property interest to the point that they can no longer enjoy their own property. And I do think that a libertarian society would uphold this, and it would be justified for maybe a private arbitration service to use not necessarily coercive powers, but because, okay, I'll just get into, how a private property society would work with this. I've already talked about the idea of, alternative or dispute resolution organizations. David D. Friedman has talked about this, and also Robert Murphy in Chaos Theory has talked about this. And I do adopt that view, not without nuance, but just the essential idea that, and this is kind of how I understand it kind of worked in Anglo-Saxon England, is that you would pledge yourself to a certain, group or 100, I guess it was called in Anglo-Saxon England, but in David D. Friedman's mind in, I just said the name of The Machinery of Freedom, he kind of saw that these would work as, dispute resolution agencies. You would pledge yourself to it. I think I described this in episode 81, but you would pledge yourself to it, and you would want it because you would submit yourself to certain rules because you would expect protection from those rules in return if someone was to aggress against you. So you would, in this instance, when you were picking a dispute resolution organization, you would submit to their rules regarding a private nuisance, because if someone showed up next door and started renting out their house, you would want a remedy yourself. So you agree to abide by their arbitration regarding a private nuisance if you were the defendant. Because if you wanted to sue someone who was, destroying the value of your land because they had really loud, boisterous people there all the time, you would want that remedy yourself. So it kind of gets rid of the whole coercive aspect in of itself, just the fact that the dispute resolution organization would be voluntary in the sense that, you would agree by the judgment, because if you did not agree to abide by their judgment, then you wouldn't have legal representation at all. There'd be no way to enforce your contracts. No one would want to do business with you because you can't keep your word. You would be shunned by the community, and you would have to, cure yourself in some kind of way to reprove to society that you were trustworthy and willing to, play fair, essentially. So I don't see any and that kind of begs the question, like, in the current system, would you be justified in using the courts and asking the courts for a nuisance, where essentially you would get an injunction which would be, in the end, backed by coercive power. You get an injunction. If he keeps renting out the place, then the state agents would go and stop him. But in doing so, they would be defending your own private property. And, obviously, I don't agree with the police with socialized security forces like that and monopoly security forces. But I do think that my aunt and uncle are justified in... I don't like the fact that they might pursue squealing on him for not having a license, but at the end of the day, they are, securing their own property interests, I think. I don't think that justifies, them telling the state that he doesn't have a license. But at the same time, my aunt and uncle are very respectable people. They are conservative libertarian types, and they have rented out property for their entire career. They've had properties, and they've played by the rules. And I know that they've spent thousands of dollars and foregone thousands of dollars to jump through the regulatory hoops that they've had to for running their own business. And for them, from their perspective, they're just pissed because, they've played by the rules all these years, and they've gone through the proper, quote unquote, proper channels, and they've gotten the licenses. And, this guy shows up and he just shits all over it. And I think that's kind of how, some law and order conservatives see the world is, I play by the rules, so therefore I'm going to make everyone else play by the rules that everyone else makes me play by. It's kind of a reciprocal enforcement thing that just keeps going on and on and on and on. So how would this... I already kind of described how I thought this would work in a libertarian society with dispute resolution organizations. I think another way that this could work would be a housing association or a homeowners association, maybe in like a Hoppian kind of like covenant community. Covenants are a little... From what I understand is that currently in our paradigm, in the status lexicon, homeowners associations have some coercive powers of the state to enforce covenants. Actually, I don't know if that's tied to the state, but I think homeowners associations do enforce covenants, which run with the land. They're kind of promises that run with the land, enforceable ones. Also, I think homeowners associations enforce zoning. So in the current system, I was kind of bummed to find that out and to hear that the homeowners association that I'm thinking about joining also does some work it's like localized lobbying that they kind of do. So if I joined it, obviously I wouldn't want to be any part of that, but I think there are valid voluntary things that they do, like fundraising, voluntarily looking after the habitat and providing homeowners on the lake with information about protecting the lake. Voluntarily, there's no, coercive enforcement there. So I'd try, if I wouldn't be a part of enforcing it. It's just something I've considered. If I haven't even joined yet, but if I could selectively apply or work on certain things and not be a part of anything else, we'll see. I don't know. But don't pull my purist libertarian card, because you'll be pedantic and you'll irritate me. But so yeah, I thought about that. The homeowners association, in covenant communities, there are a lot of benefits in a pure proprietarian society. If you had joined a homeowners association, you'd obviously be getting a lot of benefits. And if you didn't abide by, playing by the rules, which might be that, you can't rent your place out or you can't have loud parties. If you didn't abide by those rules, you'd get kicked out of the homeowners association and you'd lose all the benefits of having done that. It would be a big deal. So, yeah. I think that just kind of about covers it. So I hope that was an interesting kind of story there for you. Maybe I'll give you guys some updates on how it turns out for my aunt and uncle. And I guess once we move in too, I think we'll be hearing some of the parties, but it won't be quite as loud or as boisterous or as close to the property that we are buying. So yeah, so I wanted to hop on the horn just for this quick little episode here. And don't forget about the Liberty Weekly podcast. I have some content in the hopper that I could put out. It all depends on how I'm feeling about, what stage I am in the house buying process, or how I'm feeling about bar prep and stuff like that. So don't forget my appearance on Foreign Policy Focus with Kyle Anzalone. I talked about FBI entrapment schemes. I might put that episode in this podcast feed. I kind of thought about doing my own version of it because there's some things that I didn't feel like I stated as succinctly as I could have or as pointedly, and there's a few things that I failed to mention in that too. So check that out. I'll put a link to that in the show notes page at libertyweekly.net/82. Also, don't forget about Thijs van der Linde from the Netherlands. He's my law school buddy from across the pond. He is going to launch his show after his finals are done. I think he's in finals right now, which I totally understand. He's probably tearing his hair out. But yeah, so he's thinking about launching his show. I recorded an episode with him over spring break that I'll put in the podcast feed here for you guys to listen to. But Patreon supporters already had access to that for months. So if you like the show, you like what I do, consider supporting me on Patreon. It does help pay my hosting fees and for my website and for the podcast. So go over to patreon.com/Liberty Weekly. Also, don't forget about the Amazon affiliate links at libertyweekly.net/Amazon. It will take you right to the Amazon homepage and you can do your regular shopping. And I will get a small commission that I can use towards buying books and new material to share with you guys in the show for doing some research. And yeah, look forward to when I'm coming back. It'll probably be around August. And when I do come back, the show is going to be different in some way. I haven't thought too much about it, but I do want to stick to shorter episodes, maybe between, at the longest, 45 minutes, but really trying to stay under 30. Just like, my buddy Kyle does with the Foreign Policy Focus. I do like his format. So don't forget about DonorSee either. I'll try and include a link in the show notes page. I've really have not been paying attention to any of the social media stuff or to even the podcast statistics or anything. Well, I've been, obviously super busy. So haven't thought about that stuff, but I'll include a link to DonorSee in the show notes page as well for you guys there. So I think that about covers it, and hopefully there won't be too long of a lapse between when I put out the next episode. I think we are going to do a State of the Libertarian Union talk show maybe tomorrow. So I'll hop on that, hopefully, if everything works out. Also, I did do some video game live streaming on the Liberty Weekly channel. So youtube.com/Liberty Weekly. Or I do have my gaming channel, which is Liberty Weekly Plays. Search that in YouTube and you'll find that there. So I just did one session. I might do some more live streaming, but it's easy for me to jump on for an hour and then jump off, and there's no production time or anything like that. So yeah, really appreciate you guys. Hope you're sticking around. I miss doing the show, but obviously there are some more important things to take care of right now that demand my attention. So thanks everyone. Hope you're having a great summer so far, and we'll catch you later.
In the early days of the internet, radical libertarians were scattered, lonely, and faceless. Without direction, they resigned to scour the web, sifting through content providers in a wasteland plagued by YouTube demonetization, Facebook jail, and covert internet censorship. But then, in 2017, the Libertarian Union was formed. Finally, the average Joe libertarian could find a thriving community of independent podcasters and content providers, all in one convenient location. At Libertarian Union, we'll always have the latest news, interviews, discussions, and even movie reviews. With hundreds of episodes and more added all the time, you'll always find something fresh at libertarianunion.com.